Hey there, everybody, it's me, your buddy Dave, the host here at the Dark Stuff channel. Thanks a lot for checking out my new video. And in today's video, I'm going to be checking out a classic album, one of my favorites from the early 90s that has just been released on vinyl for the first time. And it made me remember that I actually interviewed this band 15 years ago. Okay, so the band I'm talking about is Overwhelming Colorfast, and this is their self-titled debut album. It came out, what was it, 1992, I believe? There's the original CD from back in the day. Overwhelming Colorfast was a Bay Area pop-punk band whose sound was much more on the pop side than the punk side. They got a lot of comparisons to like Hüsker Dü, Bob Mould, you know, back in their day, and they were a fantastic fucking band. Just really, really underrated, got the total shaft from the music industry like a million other bands did. For the very first time, at least in the United States, I mean, I looked it up on Discogs, it was available in like the Netherlands or something on vinyl, but the debut album, Overwhelming Colorfast, has now come out on vinyl. It's on this cool splatter vinyl, which you saw a little picture of it when I played it, but, I mean, come on, are you kidding me with that shit? This album was actually produced by Butch Vig, and if you need me to go back in time and give you the little time frame, so Butch Vig produced the first two Smashing Pumpkins albums, and he produced Nirvana Nevermind. Okay, so obviously in 1992 he was king big shit in terms of producers. He did Sonic Youth 30, he did all these, just a litany of amazing records at that time and prior to that. This Overwhelming Colorfast album was in fact the first album that Butch Vig produced after he did Nirvana Nevermind. So he literally left LA from doing Nevermind, flew back to his home studio in Madison, Wisconsin, and then cut this Overwhelming Colorfast album. I interviewed Bob Reed, the singer and guitar player, back in 2008 for my original podcast. You know, folks, I'm recording this at the beginning of February in 2023. The origins of the Dark Stuff go back 20 years to when I started the Dark Stuff as a blog. It still exists. It's out there. I haven't done anything with it, but thedarkstuff.blogspot.com, that's where it initially started. Then it became a podcast. And in one of my early podcasts, I interviewed Bob Reed from Overwhelming Colorfast. I was doing a series on sort of obscure 90s bands that I thought deserved a better audience. I wanted them to be able to tell their story. Well, that particular podcast that I did those for doesn't exist anymore, so I thought that it was just lost forever because I couldn't find it, the audio of the interview from anywhere. I found an old external hard drive in a drawer that I didn't know was there, and I had the file on it. So I've resurrected the interview from Bob Reed from Overwhelming Colorfast. Now, a couple of things about this interview. It was done in 2008. A lot has happened since then. In 2008, all their stuff was completely out of print. This was pre-streaming. There was iTunes and stuff, but it was pre-streaming. You had to go out and find their stuff, and it was pretty much all non-existent. Since that time, you can find their entire catalog on streaming. The first album is available on vinyl in a limited edition, of course, because it was for a record store day thing, I think only 1,000 copies. But I will be making a playlist of all my favorite Overwhelming Colorfast songs, and I'll link to them in below. It'll be Apple and Spotify. So another thing that happened was in 2016, the band did get back together for a show, at least. I found it on YouTube that they did play a show in 2016. So as far as I know, that was the first time since maybe 97 or 98 that the band performed together. A little note about the interview, though. I do want to point out it is a little difficult to hear. Now, not because of subject matter, okay? It's nothing like they're talking about something horrible. I did this interview in 2008, okay? Cell phone technology was not as good back then, and being able to record a telephone call was an ordeal, okay? So I had a cell phone, Bob had a cell phone, he had really shitty connection on theirs, it sounds awful. So it is sort of hard to hear, because we're using 2008 technology and we're both talking on cell phones, and so, you know, put on headphones or something. That's the best I could get it. I tried tweaking it as much as I could. It's an interesting interview. This is a band that after forming And being together only 6 months, they had a record contract with a subsidiary of Sony. They were out there on the road. They did the album with Butch Vig, the one right after Nevermind. And then, a lot of people are like, okay, well, whatever happened to them? Well, that's what the interview is for, okay? And once you listen to the interview, you'll want to try and find in a used store, if you can, or whatever, some of the old CDs. So this is actually my favorite one, 2 Words. It was their second album. It's amazing. They also have this Bender EP. They have this Sourdough EP. I don't think these EPs are on the streamers. And then their final album was called Moonlights and Castanets, and I only have a cassette of that one. That came out in, I think, 2006. I'm putting the podcast in pretty much intact, except I had to take out the music due to copyright reasons. So you hear my lame-ass intros and my discussions of the band from back in 2008. And I say it's lame because I had like a $5 Radio Shack microphone, so even those kind of sound crappy. Apologies for the sound quality. You'll enjoy this interview, though.
Bob Reed from Overwhelming Colorfast, and you're listening to the Dark Stuff Podcast.
That was a very cool 80 seconds of rock, my friends. Welcome to the Dark Stuff Podcast. This is podcast number 25, and this podcast is dedicated exclusively to Overwhelming Colorfast. This is continuing in my series of unfortunately overlooked bands from the 90s, and this band certainly fits the bill. Overwhelming Colorfast is from an area close to the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area that is, called Antioch, California. They formed in 1990, and its leader, songwriter, and only consistent member from the time the band formed in 1990 till they broke up in 1997 is Mr. Bob Reed. I interviewed Bob Reed for this podcast, and he'll be telling us the story of the band. They came out with 3 albums, 2 EPs, and a single. The first song that I played with you that opened up the show is called Toss Up. It's actually on their second album, 2 Words, but it's a re-recording of one of their own songs, which is actually on their debut single, which came out in 1991 on the Sympathy for the Record Industry label. We'll go ahead and get into the story of the band with Bob, and he tells us how he formed the band. One of the other members in the group is his brother, Dan Reed, no relation to the guy from the 80s band, the Dan Reed Network. But ironically, Dan was not the first person to join the band.
My brother was the last one to join the band, actually.
Oh, really?
The first person was Torg, a guitar player, a rhythm guitar player. And he came in playing bass, and it was he and I, just 2 of us, for about a year, and we would scope all the music magazines and all the classifieds, looking for other people to play with. And we got a bunch of really bizarre characters. And at that time, I'd actually been playing with Bean, our bass player. I'd been playing with him before that, where he just sang, he didn't play bass, and he'd never played bass before, so I taught him a few scales, and he jumped in on bass, and Torg moved to rhythm guitar. The interesting thing to note is that nobody in Colorfast had ever played their instrument before in a band, ever. I was a bass player before in bands. Bean had never played in a band before at all. My brother was a bass player, and we were having a lot of trouble finding a drummer, and my brother was like, I'm going to buy a drum kit, I'll play with you guys. I was like, yeah, sure, Dad, we'll see about that. And he did, he was great. So, and then Torg was a bass player too, and he jumped over them. So none of us had actually played our instruments. And then, I'd say 6 months after our first show, we got signed to a subsidiary of Sony.
The song is called Totally Gorgeous Foreign Chick. It's by Overwhelming Colorfast. You're listening to it here on the Dark Stuff Podcast. The song comes from the band's debut CD, came out in 1992 on Relativity Records, and one of the things that Bob told me in the interview that was pretty ingenious of these guys, how they got signed so fast, in addition to having great songs and putting on a good live show, both Bob Reed and Dan Reed worked at a record store, the same record store actually, and what they would do is they would talk to the reps, people that worked for these labels that were calling up the store and saying, hey, we want you to buy this record, that record, whatever. They'd say, okay, fine, why don't you listen to my demo tape? And their demo was so good that they got signed virtually just on that, on someone that they
had passed the tape along to while they were working in a record store, so that was pretty cool. For the debut album, the band decided to go with Butch Vig. Now, in 2008 and throughout the 90s, everybody knew Butch Vig as the guy who had the magic touch, and he was, of course, in the band Garbage. He produced Nirvana Nevermind. He did a couple of Smashing Pumpkins records. He was a big name. But back at this point, when these guys recorded their debut in 1991, Butch Vig was a much lesser-known guy. The Nirvana record had not even been released. The so-called Alternative Nation had not even been born, at least as far as the mainstream was concerned. So this was a very, very different situation when these guys worked with Butch Vig. And as you'll hear Bob tell, the band did not exactly get out of their debut album what they were hoping for.
Yeah, we were the first project that he did right after Nevermind.
Oh, okay.
And actually, when we were negotiating the album with him, as far as setting up the time and everything like that, he was in LA working on the Nirvana record. But basically, I wanted Butch for a couple of reasons. There are a couple of albums that I heard that he'd done that I really, really liked a lot. Smashing Pumpkins, Urge Overkill, The Fluid, a band on Sub Pop called The Fluid. So those are the reasons why I liked Butch. But then at the record store I worked at, we got Billboard magazine. So, I mean, we knew everything about the Nirvana Geffen deal, and then they had called Butch in to do the record. So actually when I approached Relativity and told them that I wanted Butch to do it, they were like, Butch who? And I was like, trust me, he's really good. So we called him Butch's studio to book the time, and Butch's office manager's like, well, how much you guys looking to spend? And I'm like, 35. You know, we had a budget of $35,000 to make the record. And he's all, oh, that's not very much to make a record. And I'm like, really? 35,000? He's like, oh, 35,000. I thought you meant 3,500. Because at that time, you can still get Butch Vig to record you an album for 3,500. But we had 35,000, so we had 5 weeks in the studio with Butch, and the record came out really disappointing. I was young, I was naive. I wasn't really asserting myself in the studio, and I think that Butch probably maybe didn't have the same idea in mind that I had for the record and how it was going to be. He did a great job, but just a lot of attention to detail, a lot of focus. And I didn't know that that's how records, I didn't know records could be made any other way. The initial mixes of the record, the sounds were really, really low on it, and our label insisted that we remix it, have Butch remix it, but he wasn't able to do it for a year because he was booked. And as a result of that, we got screwed, probably in the worst way, because if our album would have come out in a timely fashion when we finished it, we would have been there right as Nirvana Nevermind came out, in the very first wave of that whole scene. But as a result, we ended up having to wait a year, and the record didn't come out till '92. And by then, you had all your douchebag wannabe hair metal bands suddenly turned. The scene had become really clogged and sort of suspicious. I think that the label, I think that the label did what they could. I didn't have a manager for the band at the time. I was scared to death to turn over the reins to someone else, to give someone else control of my baby, what I had built up for that time. And I made a lot of bonehead decisions. I had a lot of, big, the guy who managed AC/DC wanted to manage us, and I was like, no, I don't think it's a good fit. So, that being said, I think that a lot of it was my own fault. I wasn't able to go in because I didn't know how to develop a marketing strategy. I didn't know, about radio promotion or press promotion, and there I was trying to do it all myself, which was pretty stupid.
Every Saturday by Overwhelming Colorfast here on the Dark Stuff podcast. That song comes on their 1994 album Two Words, the second full-length album from Overwhelming Colorfast. The song prior to that was called It's Tomorrow, another cut off the debut. Now, I wanted to point out and basically editorialize a bit here and say that the problem with the first album is not the material. The problem is the production. And although I think Butch Vig is great and he's done some amazing work, especially with Sonic Youth Dirty, where well, whatever, I don't want to go on a tangent about that. But anyhow, a frequent criticism of Butch Vig is that it was a little bit too produced, a little bit too layered, a little bit too, there's 10 vocal cuts. And I mean, anyways, he does it a little heavy. And that works on radio, and it definitely worked at that time. But for a band on their debut, in the indie world, that's looked at as a little bit suspicious. Like, why does this band sound so freaking professional, Anyways, I think Overwhelming Colorfast might have suffered a little bit from that. But as they move on to their second album, they shredded all doubt. I mean, it was just gone. The album Two Words, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I should say before that Two Words album came out, they had a little promotional EP called Bender. It wasn't commercially available, so you're going to have to really dig in a used record store and try and find it. It features one cut off the debut, which is their cover song of the Beatles' She Said, She Said, which is a good cover. And then they have 4 new recordings that were all done October 13th, 1992. It says live in one take with no overdubs. And I'm not going to play any cuts from that. They do some cool covers. You Keep Me Hanging On, which I believe is a Motown song. They cover For Emily, Whenever I May Find Her from Simon and Garfunkel. And it's just a great record, so dig around, see if you can find it. Now let's move into the Two Words period. What really makes this album so far superior, in my view, is that it really it captures the band. It's just like more of a live feel. It doesn't sound so much like a studio record. And when you listen to Overwhelming Colorfast, you hear the obvious influences of bands like Hüsker Dü, the Buzzcocks, and that was very present on the first album. But what I think you really get on the second album, on Two Words, is also you feel their appreciation for some 70s rock. I mean, it's got some real chunky, like Sabbath-style riffs mixed in with the really catchy punk songs. So let's just go ahead and have Bob tell you a little bit about the making of Two Words. They used producer Kurt Bloch, and Kurt Bloch, known as a member of the Fastbacks, a member of the Young Fresh Fellows, and a producer of a lot of really cool indie records in the early 90s.
Yeah, he had recorded with the Mises, actually. And I really liked what I heard. So, also I heard some other stuff he done. Oh, the Flop record. Yeah, the Flop record. Follow the Mop Squeezer. But that's how I got in touch with Kurt. And he came down to San Francisco, and we spent 6 weeks making the record. We had a blast. It's a huge studio in San Francisco. It used to be a distillery, a huge brick building, and with apartments on top, and it was great. We had so much fun, and it was very loose and very relaxed. But I knew very much so that I wanted to make a really live-sounding record. And we got that record in the can, and I was like, this is the one. This is the one that's going to do it. But by the time we got ready to release it, Relativity had pretty much lost interest in us. As a result of that, they only printed up 5,000 copies, didn't do any radio promotion. Actually, we had lined up a video to do for the song Roy Orbison, and I had the director Spike lined up to direct it, and we were working on a treatment, and we had contacted Roy Orbison's widow, and she was going to give us some 8mm footage of Roy Orbison home movies that nobody had ever seen. And at the last minute, Relativity was like, no, we only got enough money to do a video for you or the Beatnuts, and we're going to give the money to the Beatnuts. Okay, what happened pretty much after that record, the months following, Relativity tried to make me jump through some hoops. They decided that the band wasn't up to snuff, and they said, well, Bob, what about you just being solo, and we'll get studio guys to back you up? And I'm like, no, man, I can't ditch the guys. And then they just cut us loose. But before they did, they gave us permission to do another EP. I don't know if you've ever heard this one. That was when we came home from touring off of Two Words.
The song is called Whizzer by Overwhelming Colorfast, and you can find it on their Sourdough EP. Well, good luck finding it. It's kind of a rarity, but it's the EP that Bob was talking about there. It's pretty cool. It actually, the real standout track for me is a great cover of the Rolling Stones song Sway, which is just a great choice to begin with, and they actually do a really, really good version of it. So that EP will mark the first time that the original lineup of Overwhelming Colorfast is no longer present, as their guitarist Torg Hallen was fired. Prior to that, they brought in a new guy named Matt Harris, and he recorded on that, so that was his debut. And then, as you'll hear the story next, the band not only lost their record deal with Relativity, but eventually the entire original lineup, except for Bob Reed, was gone. Now I'll let Bob tell the story about their third and final album, Moonlights and Castanets.
I got the big band together, and with my brother, and we got a new record deal with Cargo, Headhunter. Yeah, that would have been end of 94, beginning of 95. And this is part of it. I feel a little strange talking about it. We got Kurt down to do the record again. And we had a much smaller budget with Cargo Headhunter, so I decided to record it at the 16-track studio that we did our first demos at, the one that was owned by the guy from County Crows. And I'd done a lot of work there, actually. We did the Sourdough EP there, and I'd recorded there over the years many, many times and knew the studio pretty well. But we got Kurt down and recorded the record, and it just came out sounding really strange. I don't know why. I don't know how else to put my finger on it. It just did not sound. It just sounded weird. It sounded boxy. It sounded. There wasn't anything we could do to correct it. So we turned it into the label, and they didn't really care for it either. So we recorded that, and we weren't really sure what we were going to do. But in the meantime, my brother had met a girl in Spokane, Washington, while we were on tour, and they had sort of fallen in love, and my brother decided to quit the group and go up to Spokane to live with her. So, yeah, I was pissed off at him for a long time for that, but I'm over it. We got Alex Leipenex, who was the original drummer and longtime drummer for a lookout band called the Mr. T Experience. Yeah, Alex started playing with Mr. T when he was 15, and played with him for, I guess, 8 or 9 years before he went up with us. He played with Sam I Am a little bit, too, I think. So we got Alex, and he was great. And I got the money together myself to re-record Two Words. So we went back into the same studio with all the lineup and re-recorded it. I produced it. And it came out a lot better sounding. It still sounds kind of a little bit janky, but... Moonlight and Castanets was, well, at that time, in 1996, the world was changing musically, so a lot of people were sort of jumping off that whole scene of, loud pop song type stuff and going with the next wave. So, the reviews were either this is a really great album, it's the best one yet, or same old, same old. We had a tour lined up in the fall of '96. I had it all booked and ready to go, and a week before I was supposed to leave, my bass player Matt, my guitar player Mike quit. They didn't really have a good reason. I think that they were afraid to tour in the winter. They'd never toured before. I think part of it was that the two of them had been getting together and writing songs, and they felt like I wasn't really giving them an opportunity to sort of do their own stuff musically. But 6 months later, Matt and Mike, in 1997, Matt and Mike debuted the group, which is called Oranger.
That song was called How It Should Be from Overwhelming Colorfast. Comes on their third and final album, Moonlight and Castanets, as did the song prior to that called Star Crunch. And that, my friends, is pretty much the end of the line for Overwhelming Colorfast. As you heard, the band all ditched out just before their tour in support of the album, so that was pretty much it. Bob opted not to reform the band. At that time, he had an offer from the guys in the group from San Diego called Fluff to back him up. Decided not to do it. Ironically, the guys that left the band formed the group Oranger, who are still around today, and guess who's their guitar player now? Bob Reed, right. How strange. Well, people just, it's a good thing he doesn't hold a grudge, I guess that's all I can say. And that's what Bob is up to these days. He also plays in a number of other bands, but he didn't give me too many more details about them because they're sort of in the early stages. So I hope you enjoyed the show. You're going to have to look pretty hard to find the Overwhelming Colorfast catalog, but have no fear. Someday it will be a lot easier for you to get to it, and hopefully there'll be expanded versions, because Bob did tell me that, at least for Two Words, which is their best album, that there's a whole, at least album's worth of leftovers and stuff that could possibly come out in the future. So maybe this podcast will kick-start the Overwhelming Colorfast comeback. Who knows? We're going to end the show right now with a really cool cover song that the band did. It comes from a great tribute CD to the Minutemen called Our Band Could Be Your Life, a tribute to D. Boon and the Minutemen. Playing us out, this is Overwhelming Colorfast doing Corona. This has been the Dark Stuff Podcast. Thanks a lot for listening.
To play us out. What does that mean, to play us out? I don't know what that means, to play us out. What does that mean?
All right, thanks for watching, everybody. And if you haven't already heard the band, like I said, I did make playlists for some of their stuff. These guys were really, really good. Give them a chance.